Why do we create gods? Why, across every culture, in every corner of history, do humans seem to arrive at the same conclusion? That there must be some kind of invisible being watching over them. Not just watching, but judging, comforting, controlling. It's tempting to think religion was taught to us, that we believe because someone told us to. But that's not really how beliefs work. They're not installed like apps. They evolve from something deeper, something emotional, psychological. The idea of God didn't just land on us from the outside. It grew from the inside out. Because underneath the doctrines and rituals and ancient texts, there's a very human need. A need for order, for safety, for meaning, and maybe most of all, a need for authority. Let's think about what it actually means to invent an invisible authority. One that can't be questioned, can't be seen, but is always assumed to be right. That kind of figure provides something powerful. It relieves us from the burden of choice. When someone says God wants this, or God says no, they're really outsourcing personal responsibility to an imagined higher power. In everyday life, we might challenge a boss, a parent, a politician. But God, that's a different story. Invisible authority gives us something tangible that doesn't require evidence, something that's above debate. That kind of certainty is a huge relief in a chaotic world. And this isn't just about religion, it's about psychology. There's a well-documented concept in developmental psychology called the internalized parent. It's the voice we carry in our heads, usually from childhood. The one that tells us what's good or bad, right or wrong, acceptable or shameful. Now what happens when that voice gets projected outward, into the sky, and given a name? That voice becomes God. And suddenly, what used to be your mother's disapproval, or your father's rules, becomes divine command. This transformation isn't just spiritual, it's strategic. By turning personal conscience into cosmic law, it becomes much harder to ignore. But this need goes even deeper. Humans crave structure, rules, certainty, especially when life is hard. When we're lost, scared, or grieving, the last thing we want to hear is, "No one knows why," or "Things just happen." We want answers, even if we have to invent them. God is the ultimate answer to the unanswerable. Why are we here? God. Why did this terrible thing happen? God's plan. What happens when we die? God knows. It's not that these explanations are useful in a practical sense. It's that they close the open loops in our minds. They patch the psychological holes that randomness tears open. Without God, we're left to face uncertainty, and for many people, that's unbearable. That's why belief isn't always about truth. It's about comfort. It's about regulating fear. A 2012 study in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology showed that people are more likely to affirm religious beliefs when reminded of their own mortality. The researchers called it mortality salience. In plain terms, when we think about death, we reach for meaning. And what offers more comforting meaning than the idea of a loving creator with a perfect plan? This isn't a small detail. It's the foundation of religious persistence. Because even when beliefs contradict science, history, or even themselves, people cling to them. Not because they're logical, but because they're emotionally necessary. And the idea of a God serves multiple psychological roles at once. Parent, judge, protector, rescuer, purpose giver. That's a lot of emotional needs tied into one invisible figure. This isn't unique to one religion. The faces may change. Yahweh, Allah, Shiva, Zeus, Odin. But the structure stays the same. All-powerful, all-knowing, all-just, and crucially, always watching. This last part is important. The feeling of being watched, even when alone, has powerful behavioral effects. A 2006 study at Newcastle University tested this by placing posters of eyes above a workplace honesty box, just a donation tray for tea and coffee. The result? People paid significantly more when they felt they were being watched, even by a picture. Now imagine the effect of believing an actual cosmic judge is observing your every move. God functions as a psychological surveillance system. Not only does it influence what we do, it shapes what we think about doing. And this is where things start to cross from comfort into control. Invisible authority doesn't just guide behavior, it dictates it. Throughout history, those in power have quickly realized this. Kings, emperors, popes, politicians, they've all used the authority of God to legitimize their rule. Why justify your policies with reason when you can claim divine backing? You don't need to argue when you can just say it's God's will. The genius and danger of invisible authority is that it bypasses logic. You can't argue with what can't be questioned. But it's not always imposed from above. Sometimes we create these mental chains ourselves. When we're children, we need authority to survive. But as adults, we often carry that same need into our beliefs. We crave guidance, even when it limits us. We seek permission, even when it's unnecessary. And we fear freedom, because freedom means responsibility. So we construct gods that give us rules, meaning, and purpose. Not because they're real, but because they feel real enough. This is how psychological needs evolve into metaphysical beliefs. But there's a trade-off. In exchange for emotional comfort, we sometimes surrender intellectual honesty. We overlook contradictions. We ignore evidence. We silence doubts. Because the belief isn't built on logic. It's built on fear, on longing, on a deep human urge to be protected and guided. That doesn't make believers weak. It makes them human. But it does raise a question. What happens when we outgrow that need? Some do. They find other forms of guidance, philosophy, science, personal ethics, or shared human values. Others hold on, not because they still believe, but because they don't know who they'd be without it. God, for many, becomes part of identity. Questioning that belief can feel like tearing up the foundation of your own mind. That's why debates about religion are rarely about ideas. They're about selves, about emotional scaffolding. You can't remove a God from someone's mind without risking a collapse of meaning. Which is why arguments, no matter how logical, rarely change anyone's beliefs. Because belief isn't about logic. It's about narrative, story, identity, safety. But once we see that, we can start asking better questions. Not just, is God real? But, why do we need him to be? What fear are we avoiding? What role is this belief filling? What personal responsibility have we handed over to the skies? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're liberating ones. Because once we understand why we created gods, we can start taking back control from the invisible authorities we once needed. We don't need to replace them with other absolutes. We just need the courage to sit with uncertainty, to accept that not everything has a reason, and still find meaning anyway. That's not cold or hopeless. It's powerful. It means we are the authors now, not invisible beings, not ancient texts, not imagined fathers in the sky. Just humans, building lives, facing reality, and finding meaning, not because someone tells us what it is, but because we're brave enough to seek it ourselves. And maybe that is enough.